Somewhere beneath the roots of the world, in caverns older than sunlight, the hammers never stop. Listen. Through the silence of ages, through the weight of stone and the memory of ice, you can almost hear them. The rhythmic percussion of metal striking metal, sparks cascading like fallen stars into the eternal dark. This is the sound of creation itself, not the thunderous word of God speaking worlds into being, but something older, something more patient. The sound of hands shaping destiny from raw matter, the sound of the Dvergar at their forges. We call them dwarves now, these master craftsmen of the Norse cosmos, and the word carries with it centuries of accumulated imagery, diminutive figures from fairy tales, comic relief in modern fantasy, miners with pickaxes and songs. But strip away those later accretions, return to the original texts, and you will find something far stranger, far more profound. The Dvergar of the Norse tradition are not merely skilled artisans or underground dwellers. They are fundamental to the very architecture of existence. They hold up the sky, they forge the weapons that will end the world, and their origins reach back to the primordial moment when the cosmos itself was assembled from the corpse of a murdered giant. To understand the Dvergar, we must begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of their race, but the beginning of everything. And for that, we turn to a cold evening in 13th century Iceland, where a man named Snorri Sturluson sat composing what would become our most comprehensive source for Norse mythology. Snorri was a complicated figure, a chieftain, a poet, a politician who would ultimately meet his end at the wrong side of Norwegian royal ambitions, cut down in his own cellar by men who came in the night. But before that violent conclusion, he gathered the scattered traditions of his ancestors and wove them into the text we call the Prose Edda, also known as the Younger Edda, written sometime around 1220. In it, he preserved stories that would otherwise have vanished into the silent centuries, tales that had been passed down through generations of skalds before the coming of Christianity finally silenced the old religion. The Prose Edda opens with a curious framing device. Snorri presents the Norse myths as a kind of elaborate misunderstanding. The gods were actually ancient kings from Troy, he claims, their supernatural powers merely exaggerations accumulated over time. This euhemeristic approach served a purpose in Snorri's Christian Iceland, providing intellectual cover for preserving what might otherwise have been condemned as dangerous pagan material. But behind this veneer of rationalization, the myths themselves pulse with their original strange power. In the section called Gylfaginning, the tricking of Gylfi, Snorri describes the creation of the cosmos. Before there was earth or heaven, before the seas or the sky, there was only Ginnungagap, the yawning void, the primordial emptiness between realms of fire and ice. To the north lay Niflheim, a world of frozen mist and endless cold. To the south burned Muspelheim, where flames licked at the darkness and sparks rose like angry swarms into the void. Where the heat of Muspelheim met the frost of Niflheim, where fire kissed ice in the depths of Ginnungagap, something extraordinary occurred. The melting rime began to take shape, to quicken, to live. The first being to emerge from this elemental marriage was Ymir, a primordial giant of such vast scale that later mountains would be carved from his eyebrows, and the dome of the sky constructed from his skull. Ymir was hermaphroditic, self-generating, producing other giants from his own body as he slept. From the sweat of his armpits came a male and female giant. His legs mated with each other to produce a six-headed son. These were the founders of the Jotun race, the giants who would stand in eternal opposition to the gods. But Ymir was not alone for long. The melting ice also produced a cow, Odumbla, whose milk sustained the giant. And as Odumbla licked the salt from the frozen blocks around her, she gradually revealed another figure trapped within. First the hair, then the head, then the complete form of a being called Buri. Buri's son Bor married a giantess named Bestla, and from this union came three brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve. These three would become the first gods, and their initial act of power would be murder on a cosmic scale. The sons of Bor rose against Ymir and killed him. The flood of blood from his wounds was so vast that it drowned nearly all the giants. Only two escaped to continue their kind, drifting across the red deluge on a makeshift vessel. And from Ymir's corpse, the three brothers began to construct the universe. Here is where the Dvergar first enter our story. Though their entrance is peculiar, almost parenthetical, as if they sprang into existence as a necessary byproduct of cosmic construction. Snorri tells us in Gylfaginning that from Ymir's flesh the earth was made, from his blood the seas, from his bones the mountains, from his teeth and broken bones the rocks and stones, from his hair the trees, from his skull the dome of heaven. But there is another element of his body that gave rise to life, and this is a stranger birth than any other. According to Snorri, the dwarves first came into being as maggots in the flesh of Ymir. They quickened in the rotting meat of the dead giant, generated spontaneously from corruption like flies from carrion. But the gods saw them, and by divine decree, they were granted consciousness and form, shaped into something approximating human appearance with intelligence to match. This is a peculiar origin, simultaneously humble and profound. The Dvergar are creatures of decay transformed by divine will, beings whose very existence emerges from the death that preceded creation. But we must be careful here, for the sources do not speak with one voice. Turn to the older text, the Poetic Edda, that collection of anonymous poems preserved primarily in a single 13th century Icelandic manuscript known as the Codex Regius, and you will find a different, perhaps earlier account of dwarven origins. The Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, offers a creation narrative of its own, and here the Dvergar emerge not from maggots, but from the earth itself, from the blood and bones of the primordial matter. The relevant stanzas are enigmatic, as much of the Völuspá tends to be. The seeress speaks of the gods taking counsel, deciding to create the dwarven race from the bloodied sea and the limbs of Blaine, an obscure figure who may be another name for Ymir, or perhaps a different primordial being altogether. The text then gives us what scholars call the Dvergatal, the tally of the dwarves, a long catalogue of dwarven names that reads almost like an ancient attendance roll. And what names they are. Motsugnir, apparently the first among them, whose name might mean mead drinker, or perhaps something more obscure, Durin the second, whose name suggests sleep or perhaps death. Then an extensive list, Ni and Nidi, Nordri and Sudri, Ostri and Vestri. These directional names will prove significant. Althifr and Divalin, Bifur and Bofur, Nar and Nine, Nipinga and Dain. The catalogue continues, name after name, many of which would later be borrowed by J.R.R. Tolkien for his own fantasy creations, forming a direct line of inheritance from medieval Iceland to modern popular culture. Scholars have long debated the purpose and significance of the Dvergatal. Some see it as an interpolation, a later addition to the Völuspá that may have circulated independently as a separate list before being incorporated into the poem. Others argue that such catalogues served mnemonic or ritual purposes, that the act of naming these beings was itself a form of invocation or acknowledgement of their power. What is undeniable is that the sheer length and detail of the list suggests the Dvergar held a significant place in the Norse imagination. They were important enough to warrant extensive enumeration, their names important enough to preserve. The contradiction between Snorri's maggot origin and the Völuspá's more dignified emergence remains unresolved, and perhaps it should. These were not systematic theologians working from a unified creed, but poets and storytellers working within a living tradition that could accommodate multiple versions of the same truth. Perhaps the Dvergar were maggots transformed. Perhaps they were shaped deliberately from blood and bone. Perhaps both accounts capture different aspects of a mystery that words cannot fully contain. What matters is what both accounts agree upon. The Dvergar are ancient. They are connected to the fundamental matter of creation, and they possess skills and knowledge that set them apart from gods and humans alike. Now, we come to one of the most striking functions the Dvergar perform in the Norse cosmos, a function so fundamental that without them, the sky itself would collapse. The Völuspá mentions 4 dwarves with directional names, Nordri, Sudri, Ostri and Vestri, north, south, east and west. These 4 were assigned by the gods to hold up the sky at its 4 corners, and there they remain, silent sentinels supporting the dome of heaven on their shoulders. Consider this image for a moment. Every time the Norse looked up at the blue vault of day or the star-scattered darkness of night, they were looking at a structure held in place by 4 dwarven figures at the edges of the world. This is not a minor decorative role, this is architectural necessity. The Dvergar are load-bearing elements of reality itself. Without them, Ymir's skull would crash down upon the earth, and the cosmos would collapse back into the void of Ginnungagap. Snorri mentions this arrangement in Gylfaginning, and it appears to be one of the uncontested elements of the tradition. But as with so much in Norse mythology, the texts give us only the bare outline and leave us to imagine the rest. How were these four chosen? Did they volunteer for this eternal duty, or were they assigned by divine fiat? Do they grow weary beneath their burden, their arms aching with the weight of the heavens, or is their strength inexhaustible? Are they conscious up there at the world's edge, watching the ages pass, the seasons turn, the gods and giants play out their ancient enmity? Or have they become something other than conscious, structural elements now as much a part of the cosmic architecture as the pillars of a temple? The texts do not tell us, but the image persists. Four dwarven figures at the corners of existence, holding up the sky so that we might live beneath it. This combination of humble origins and cosmic responsibility speaks to something essential about the Dvergar's place in the Norse worldview. They are subterranean creatures associated with darkness and stone, with the earth's depths and the cold places beneath mountains, yet they are also indispensable to the gods, crafting the very weapons and treasures that define divine power. The hammer of Thor, the spear of Odin, the ring that produces wealth, the ship that folds like cloth, the fetter that binds the world-devouring wolf, all these come from dwarven forges, shaped by dwarven hands, imbued with dwarven cunning. The relationship between gods and Dvergar is complex, marked by both necessity and tension. The gods need what the dwarves can make. The dwarves possess knowledge and skills the gods lack. But this relationship is not one of easy alliance. The myths are full of trickery and conflict, of gods manipulating dwarves and dwarves seeking revenge, of treasures won through wagers and threats, and the kind of desperate bargaining that leaves no party entirely satisfied. Before we delve into the great stories of dwarven craftsmanship, let us pause to consider what the Dvergar actually were, their nature, their dwelling places, their relationship to light and darkness. Here again, the sources offer partial pictures that we must assemble with care. The name itself, Dvergar, in Old Norse, has an uncertain etymology. Some scholars have connected it to a Proto-Germanic root meaning to deceive or to damage, suggesting that dwarves were originally conceived as malevolent spirits or tricksters. Others propose a connection to words meaning to squeeze or to press, perhaps referencing their association with underground spaces or the weight of earth and stone above their heads. Still others have suggested links to Indo-European roots relating to dreams or ghostly apparitions. The truth is that the original meaning has been lost. We cannot be certain what the word meant to those who first spoke it. What we can say is that the Dvergar dwell underground. They are associated with rocks and mountains, with the dark places beneath the earth where no sunlight penetrates. Their domain is the opposite of Asgard's bright halls. They inhabit a world of eternal shadow, lit only by the glow of their forges and whatever luminescence the depths might provide. This association with darkness is reinforced by a crucial piece of dwarven lore. According to multiple sources, dwarves cannot endure sunlight. Exposure to the sun's rays will turn them to stone. We see this most dramatically in the tale of the dwarf Alvis, which we will explore in detail later in this narrative. But the motif appears elsewhere as well, suggesting it was a deeply embedded element of dwarven nature. They are creatures of the dark, and the dark is where they belong. This sets up a fundamental opposition. The Dvergar are necessary to the order of existence. They create the gods' most prized possessions. They literally hold up the sky, and yet they are also fundamentally other, belonging to a realm that the gods' light cannot reach. Some scholars have seen in this a reflection of ancient attitudes toward craftsmen and their ambiguous social position. Skilled artisans were necessary to society. Their work was valued and even revered, but they were also set apart, associated with the uncanny transformations of raw matter into finished goods. The smith's forge was a liminal space where metal became weapons, where ore became treasure, where the crude stuff of the earth was refined into objects of power and beauty. Those who presided over such transformations occupied an uncertain social category, respected for their skills, needed for their products, but somehow not quite belonging to the daylight world of farmers and warriors and kings. Whether or not the Dvergar originated as mythological reflections of human smiths, they certainly came to embody the ambiguities of craft in its most exalted form. Their creations are unmatched. Even the gods cannot replicate what the dwarves can make. But this very superiority carries with it a kind of danger. Beings who can create items of such power are not to be trifled with. Dealings with them are fraught with risk. Throughout the myths, we see the gods approaching the Dvergar with a mixture of need and caution, seeking their services while remaining wary of their cunning. The physical appearance of the Dvergar is never precisely described in the original sources. Snorri tells us they were given human form and intelligence, but this tells us little about their specific characteristics. The assumption of small stature, so prevalent in later folklore, finds little support in the earliest texts. The poetic Edda names several dwarves in contexts where nothing about their size is indicated one way or another. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that the original Dvergar were conceived as human-sized beings, with the diminution of dwarves into small creatures occurring only in later Scandinavian folk tradition. What the texts do emphasise is their skill, their wisdom, and their connection to the underground world. They know the secrets of metals, they understand the properties of materials, they can fashion objects with powers no other beings can replicate. This knowledge sets them apart even from the Aesir, who must come to the Dvergar when they need items of true magical significance. Now, we must turn to the tales themselves, the stories of how specific dwarven creations came into being and what purposes they served, and we might as well begin with the most famous of all, the object that has come to symbolise Norse mythology in the modern imagination more than any other, the hammer of Thor, called Mjolnir. The story of Mjolnir's creation is preserved in the Prose Edda, in a section called the Skaldskaparmal, the language of poetry. It begins, as so many Norse tales do, with Loki causing trouble. Loki? That complicated figure who is both one of the Aesir and their eventual betrayer, that trickster god whose antics drive so much of the mythological action. Loki had done something particularly egregious. He had cut off the golden hair of Sif, Thor's wife, and Thor was not pleased. The thunder god seized Loki and threatened to break every bone in his body unless Loki made amends. Desperate to preserve his skeletal integrity, Loki promised to descend to Svartalfaheim, the realm of the Dark Elves or Black Elves, a domain closely associated or perhaps identical with the realm of the Dwarves, and obtain new hair for Sif, hair of gold that would grow like natural hair once placed upon her head. Loki made his way into the depths and came to the sons of Ivaldi, a group of dwarven smiths of renowned skill. They agreed to make the golden hair, and being the craftsmen they were, they did not stop there. While their forges were hot and their tools were ready, they also fashioned two other treasures, a ship called Skidbladnir and a spear called Gungnir. Consider these creations and what they represent. Skidbladnir was the finest of all ships. It could hold all the gods with their weapons and equipment, yet it could be folded up like a cloth and carried in one's pocket. It would always have a favourable wind once its sail was raised, carrying its passengers wherever they wished to go. This is not merely a boat. This is an answer to the problem of transportation itself, a vessel that combines infinite capacity with perfect portability that bends the very winds to its purpose. Gungnir, the spear made for Odin, would become the All-Father's defining weapon. Its most famous property was that it never missed its mark when thrown. Once hurled, it would strike what its wielder intended. But beyond this practical advantage, Gungnir carried ritual significance. Oaths sworn on Gungnir's point could not be broken. The spear became a symbol of Odin's authority as the chief of the gods. When Odin hurled Gungnir over the heads of the Vanir host at the beginning of the First War, it was a declaration of conflict, a ritual opening of hostilities that would define the shape of cosmic struggle. And the golden hair for Sif? We hear little more about it after its creation, but the image lingers, hair of actual gold, yet living and growing, replacing what Loki's malice had taken. The dwarves of Ivaldi had answered a request and added generously to it, demonstrating their craft in the casual creation of objects that would shape the fate of gods. But Loki, being Loki, could not leave well enough alone. On his way back through the underground realm, he encountered two other dwarves, brothers named Brokkr and Sindri, sometimes called Eitri in other versions of the tale, and Loki, perhaps drunk on his success, perhaps simply unable to resist stirring up trouble, made a wager with them. He bet his own head that Brokkr and Sindri could not make 3 treasures equal to those of Ivaldi's sons. This was a dangerous bet, and Loki may have underestimated his opponents. Brokkr and Sindri were supreme craftsmen, and they accepted the wager with confidence. Sindri went to work at the forge while Brokkr was assigned to work the bellows, keeping the fire at precisely the right temperature. What follows is a curious episode that gives us a rare glimpse into the dwarven creative process. As Sindri worked his craft, a fly appeared in the smithy, a fly that was almost certainly Loki in disguise, attempting to sabotage the competition he had set in motion. The fly bit Brokkr on the arm as he worked the bellows, but Brokkr did not falter. From the forge emerged a boar with golden bristles called Gullinbursti that could run through air and water, over land and sea, faster than any horse, and whose bristles glowed so brightly that they banished darkness wherever it went. This boar would become the mount of the god Freyr. Sindri set to work on the second creation, and again the fly attacked, this time biting Brokkr on the neck. Still, Brokkr kept the bellows pumping, though the pain was greater now. From this labour came Draupnir, a gold ring with an extraordinary property. Every 9th night, 8 new rings of equal weight and quality would drip from it. Draupnir was wealth that generated itself, treasure that multiplied beyond the dreams of any king. This ring would be placed on Odin's arm, and would later play a role in the grief-stricken funeral of Baldur, sent to the pyre with the god's body as a last gift from his father. But it was the third creation that would prove most fateful, and here Loki made his most desperate effort at sabotage. As Sindri worked at the forge, shaping the most crucial object yet, the fly landed between Brokkr's eyes and bit him on the eyelids. Blood ran down into Brokkr's eyes, blinding him, and for just a moment, a single moment, he raised his hand from the bellows to wipe away the blood. That moment of interrupted breath, that brief faltering of the fire's heat, had consequences. When Sindri drew the final object from the forge, it was a hammer of incomparable power, but with a flaw. Its handle was shorter than it should have been. Had the bellows never faltered, the hammer's handle would have been of proper length. As it was, Thor would wield Mjolnir one-handed, its abbreviated grip a permanent reminder of Loki's sabotage. And yet, despite this flaw, Mjolnir was magnificent. It would never fail to strike what Thor aimed at, it would always return to his hand when thrown. Most importantly, it could strike as hard as Thor wished, and nothing could withstand its blow. Mountains shattered before Mjolnir, giants fell. The very forces of chaos recoiled from its thunder. The gods judged the contest, and despite Loki's machinations, despite the shortened handle, they declared Mjolnir the greatest treasure of all. The hammer that would become synonymous with Thor, the weapon that would hold back the tide of chaos until the final days, had been forged by dwarven hands in the deep places of the earth. Loki had lost his wager, and Brokkr came to collect his due, Loki's head, as promised. But Loki, ever the escape artist, found a loophole in his own bargain. He had wagered his head, yes, but not his neck. Brokkr could take the head if he could do so without touching the neck, a logical impossibility that left the dwarf cheated of his prize. Brokkr's rage at this trickery was not to be entirely denied, however. If he could not take Loki's head, he could at least silence that lying mouth. With an awl and leather thong, Brokkr sewed Loki's lips shut, a punishment that would not last forever, but which satisfied the dwarf's sense of justice for a time. The image is grotesque, the silver-tongued god reduced to muffled protests, his instrument of chaos temporarily bound. It is a rare moment of consequences for Loki, and it came at the hands of a dwarf who refused to be cheated entirely. This contest between the sons of Ivaldi and the brothers Brokkr and Sindri reveals something essential about the dwarves' role in Norse cosmology. They are not merely servants of the gods, not simple craftsmen waiting for commissions. They are rivals to each other, competitive creators whose pride in their work drives them to ever greater achievements. The treasures that emerge from this contest, Gullinbursti, Draupnir and Mjolnir, joined Sif's golden hair, Gungnir and Skidbladnir, as the defining objects of divine power. In a single episode born of Loki's mischief, the dwarves had equipped the Aesir with the tools of their authority. Without these gifts, forged in underground fires by hands that never knew sunlight, the gods would have been diminished, their power incomplete. The Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda sometimes diverge in their telling of these tales, and scholars have long noted the variations. Snorri Sturluson, writing his Edda in 13th century Iceland, was working from older oral traditions and perhaps from written sources now lost to us. His account of the treasure's forging is relatively cohesive, a narrative shaped by a Christian scholar attempting to preserve and explain the old beliefs. The Poetic Edda, that collection of older verses, offers fragments and allusions rather than connected prose. In the poem Grimni's Mal, Odin speaks of Skidbladnir as the best of ships, made for Freyr by the sons of Ivaldi, but gives no account of the circumstances. In Skaldskapar Mal, Snorri expands what the poems merely mention, weaving context and motivation around the sparse bones of verse. This relationship between the two Eddas is crucial for understanding what we know of the Dwarves. Snorri was a storyteller as much as a preserver. He connected episodes, provided motivations, smoothed over contradictions. The older poems offer glimpses without explanation, names without context, deeds without surrounding narrative. When we read of dwarven craft in Snorri, we must remember that we are reading one man's interpretation of a tradition that had many tellers over many centuries. The dwarves may have been imagined differently in different times and places across the Norse world, their nature shifting with the concerns of those who spoke of them. Yet certain elements remain consistent. The dwarves are always associated with making, with craft, with the transformation of raw material into objects of power. They are always of the earth, emerging from it, dwelling within it, returning to it. And they are always somewhat apart from the other beings of the cosmos. Not gods, not giants, not humans, not elves, but their own category of existence, defined by what they do rather than what they are. This brings us to one of the more mysterious dwarven creations, Gleipnir, the fetter that bound the wolf Fenrir. The story of Fenrir's binding is among the most tension-filled in Norse mythology, a tale of prophecy, fear, and the lengths to which the gods would go to forestall their own doom. Fenrir was the offspring of Loki and the giantess Angerboda, and from his birth the gods sensed danger. Prophecy spoke of the wolf's role in the end times, of Odin's death in Fenrir's jaws, of chaos unleashed upon the cosmos. The Aesir decided that the wolf must be bound, must be contained until the day of reckoning that they could not prevent but might at least delay. Their first attempts were humiliating failures. They forged a chain called Ledinga and brought it to Fenrir under the guise of a game. "Let us test your strength," they said. "See if you can break free of this bond." Fenrir, young and confident, allowed himself to be bound, and then burst the chain with a single kick. The gods forged a second chain, Dromi, twice as strong as the first. Again the game, again the binding, and again Fenrir shattered his bonds, though this time with more effort. The wolf was growing, both in size and in suspicion. The gods knew they needed something stronger, something beyond their own craft to forge, and so they turned to the dwarves. Messengers were sent to Svartalfaheimr, to the realm of dark elves and dwarves, with a desperate commission: create a fetter that the wolf cannot break. The dwarves who answered this call are not named in some versions, though the realm from which they worked is clear. What they produced was unlike any chain the gods had imagined. Gleipnir did not look like a chain at all. It was smooth as a silk ribbon, soft and light, seemingly incapable of binding anything. The gods who received it must have wondered if the dwarves were mocking them. But Gleipnir was made from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. These are things that do not exist, or do not exist in the way the fetter demanded. This is why, the tales tell us, cats make no sound when they walk, women have no beards, mountains have no roots that we can see, and the rest, the dwarves took what could not be and wove it into what was. They created substance from absence, strength from impossibility. This is perhaps the most magical of all dwarven achievements, and it reveals a dimension of their craft that goes beyond smithing and metalwork. The dwarves could work with the fabric of reality itself, taking concepts and negations and transforming them into physical objects. Gleipnir was unbreakable precisely because it was made of things that could not be broken, things that could not even be grasped by ordinary understanding. The dwarves had access to the seams of the cosmos, the places where meaning and matter met, and they could stitch new things from that liminal cloth. When the gods brought Gleipnir to Fenrir, the wolf was immediately suspicious. This slender ribbon, this soft-looking strip, it was too different from the chains he had broken before. The gods again proposed a game, a test of strength, but Fenrir sensed treachery. He agreed to be bound only if one of the gods would place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. If the binding was truly a game, if he would truly be released, then the god's hand would be safe. But if the gods meant to betray him, he would have his price. It was Tyr who stepped forward, Tyr the god of war and of oaths, who placed his right hand between the jaws of the wolf. Gleipnir was wound around Fenrir's limbs, and when the wolf strained against it, expecting it to give way like the chains before, nothing happened. He strained harder. The silk-smooth ribbon held. He thrashed, he twisted, he put all his terrible growing strength against that impossible fetter, and Gleipnir only tightened. It would not break, could not break, because it was made of things that had no breaking point, no existence to be destroyed. The gods laughed at the bound wolf, all except Tyr, who at that moment felt Fenrir's jaws close. The wolf bit off Tyr's hand at the wrist, the price of the gods' deception, the cost of containing chaos even temporarily. A sword was placed in Fenrir's mouth to hold it open, and there the wolf would remain until Ragnarok, his howls filling the place of his imprisonment, his drool forming a river called Van, which means hope or expectation, a grim name for a river of a captive monster's saliva. The dwarven craft had accomplished what the gods themselves could not. Gleipnir held where divine-forged chains had failed. It is a remarkable testament to the dwarves' singular role in the Norse cosmos. When the gods faced problems beyond their own abilities, they turned to the creatures of the underground realm. Whether the task was forging weapons, creating treasures, or binding apocalyptic beasts, the dwarves were the answer to divine inadequacy. But the relationship between gods and dwarves was not one of simple employment and payment. The dwarves had their own pride, their own agendas, their own sense of justice and grievance. This is nowhere clearer than in the story of Alvis, the dwarf who sought to marry Thor's daughter. The tale comes to us primarily from the poem Alvismal in the poetic Edda, a poem structured as a contest of knowledge between Thor and the dwarf, who dared to claim a goddess for his bride. Alvis, whose name means all-wise, came to Asgard seeking the hand of Thruda, Thor's daughter. The circumstances of this arrangement are murky. Some versions suggest that the gods had promised Thruda to the dwarf, perhaps in payment for some service, perhaps as a careless oath made in Thor's absence. When Thor returned and found a dwarf claiming rights to his daughter, he was not pleased. But rather than simply refusing outright, rather than resorting to violence, Thor proposed a test. If Alvis was truly all-wise, let him prove it. Let him answer every question Thor posed about the nature of the world. What follows is one of the most linguistically fascinating texts in the Old Norse corpus. Thor asks Alvis to name the earth, the sky, the moon, the sun, the clouds, the wind, the sea, fire, forest, night, grain, and ale. But he asks for more than single names. He asks what each thing is called by different beings, by humans, by gods, by the Vanir, by giants, by elves, by the dwarves themselves, and in some cases by the inhabitants of Hell. Alvis answers every question, demonstrating a comprehensive knowledge of the poetic vocabularies used throughout the cosmos. The poem thus becomes a catalogue of kennings and heti, the poetic synonyms that Old Norse poets used to vary their language and display their learning. The earth, Alvis tells us, is called Jord by humans, Fold by the Aesir, Vega by the Vanir, Ygran by giants, Or by elves, and Or by the dwarves in Hell. The sky has its own list of names, and the moon, and every other element that Thor names. Through Alvis's answers, we receive a lexicon of the mythological world, a catalogue of how different beings perceive and name reality. But this wisdom, however impressive, does not save Alvis. Thor had a secondary purpose in his questioning. He was playing for time. The contest of knowledge continued through the night, question after question, answer after answer, until the first light of dawn began to creep above the horizon. And here we encounter the dwarves' fatal vulnerability. They cannot endure sunlight. When the sun's rays touched Alvis, he was turned to stone, petrified at the very threshold of success. Thor's final words are almost mocking. "You have been tricked, dwarf, by all your wisdom," as daylight claims his opponent. The petrification of dwarves in sunlight appears in several Norse sources and connects to their chthonic nature. Creatures of the deep earth, of darkness and underground fires, they cannot survive in the realm of the celestial. The sun, that great enemy of trolls and dark beings throughout Germanic folklore, is equally deadly to dwarves. Alvis's fate was not violent, not a battle or an execution, but a natural consequence of his underground nature meeting the above-ground world where he did not belong. The Alvismal has puzzled scholars for centuries. Is it a genuine mythological narrative, or is it a pedagogical poem designed to teach young poets the vocabulary they would need for their craft? Perhaps it is both. The story provides a narrative frame for what is essentially a list of synonyms, making the learning entertaining, giving the lexicon a plot. Thor's cunning, his unusual use of intellect over strength, provides tension. Alvis's ultimate fate provides closure, and woven throughout is the characterization of dwarves as beings of vast knowledge, able to speak the languages of every realm, yet ultimately bound by their nature to the darkness from which they came. The dwarves' encyclopedic knowledge, as demonstrated by Alvis, connects to their role as creators. To make a thing is to know it intimately, to understand its names in all the languages of all the beings who might use or encounter it. The dwarves, as the forgers of the gods' treasures, would need to understand not just the materials of their craft, but the purposes and contexts of what they made. A weapon for Thor would need to embody thunder and battle. A ring for Odin would need to hold wealth and sacrifice. A ship for Freyr would need to know both wind and the folding of space. The dwarves' wisdom was not abstract. It was craft knowledge, maker's knowledge, the understanding that comes from working with the stuff of reality. Yet this wisdom could not save them from their own limitations. Alvis perished with answers on his lips, turned to stone by the light he had forgotten to fear in his eagerness to claim a divine bride. The dwarves' tragedy throughout the Norse corpus is their proximity to greatness without the ability to fully claim it. They make the treasures of the gods but are not gods themselves. They possess knowledge equal to any being in the cosmos, but cannot walk freely in the upper world. They are essential to the functioning of the universe. Without them the sky would fall, yet they dwell in darkness, in the spaces between, in the margins of the mythological narrative. This marginal status becomes especially poignant when we consider the dwarves' role in eschatology, in the prophecies of what is to come. The great poem Völuspá, the seeress' prophecy, describes the fate of all things at Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the destruction and rebirth of the world. And the dwarves appear in this vision, though their role is not always clear. Before the final battle, before the wolf breaks free and the serpent rises, the poem describes groaning dwarves, weeping before their stone doors. The image is one of foreknowledge and helplessness. The dwarves, those creatures of deep wisdom, know what is coming. They have perhaps always known, since the moment of their creation from Ymir's flesh, that all things move toward ending. Their treasures, those magnificent objects they forged for the gods, will be present at Ragnarok. Mjolnir in Thor's hand as he faces the world serpent, Gungnir in Odin's grip as he rides to meet Fenrir, Gleipnir straining and finally breaking as the wolf shakes free of his bonds. The dwarves' work will be tested in the final fire, and some of it will fail, not from any flaw in the making, but because nothing made can withstand the unmaking of all things. The stanza in Völuspá that depicts the dwarves at the world's ending is haunting in its brevity. The seeress, speaking from her trance of cosmic vision, describes them moaning before their doorways of stone, those same thresholds between the underground realm and the world above that had always marked the boundary of dwarven existence. The Old Norse word used suggests a sound of distress, of lamentation, and we must imagine these beings who had worked in fire and metal, who had shaped the very tools of divine power, now standing helpless as reality itself begins to crack. They had held up the sky since the First Age. They had made the weapons that would be wielded in the last battle, and now they could only watch and weep as the threads of fate wound toward their conclusion. The placement of the dwarves in Völuspá is significant. They appear in the catalogue of portents, among the signs that herald the approaching doom. The sun turns black, the earth sinks into the sea, the stars vanish from the sky, and the dwarves groan. Their reaction becomes part of the cosmic texture of the end, a voice in the chorus of lamentation that rises from all corners of existence. They are not warriors who will fight at Ragnarok. There is no suggestion that dwarves join the Einherjar on the plains of Vigridr, no tale of dwarven champions standing against the forces of destruction. Their role is to witness, to mourn, to embody the grief of all those who had made and created and built, watching their works unmade. Yet the Völuspá also speaks of what comes after. Beyond the fire and the flood, beyond the death of gods and the swallowing of the sun, the poem envisions renewal. A new earth rises from the waters, green and fertile, with waterfalls cascading down mountainsides and eagles hunting fish in pristine streams. The surviving gods, Balder returned from Hel, the sons of Thor, others who weathered the storm, gather on the grass where Asgard once stood and speak of ancient runes and the great events of the past. They find in the grass the golden gaming pieces that the gods once played with in the morning of the world, before greed and conflict and the breaking of oath set all things on the path to destruction. What then of the dwarves in this renewed world? The poem does not say explicitly. It does not describe dwarves emerging from their stone halls to begin crafting anew, nor does it suggest that they perished utterly in the conflagration. This silence has prompted centuries of speculation. Some scholars have argued that the dwarves, as beings connected to the earth itself, would naturally survive the cosmic upheaval, that their underground realm, however shaken, would endure as the framework of the new world just as it had supported the old. The 4 dwarves at the cardinal points holding up the dome of the sky would presumably still be necessary. Without Nordri, Sudri, Ostri and Vestri at their posts, the heavens would collapse onto the reborn earth just as surely as they would have crushed the original creation. Others have seen in the dwarves groaning a kind of death knell, a suggestion that these beings, so intimately tied to the first creation, could not survive into the second. The stuff of Ymir, from which both dwarves and the original cosmos were made, would be consumed in the fires of Surtur. A new creation would require new sources, new materials, new makers. This reading casts the dwarves as essentially Edenic beings, creatures of the first age whose purpose was fulfilled in that age and who had no place in what came after. Their tears before the stone doors become a farewell not just to the world, but to their own existence. The textual evidence is frustratingly sparse. Snorri Sturluson, in his prose Edda, does not elaborate significantly on the dwarves' fate at Ragnarok, focusing instead on the deaths of the major gods and the survival of specific Aesir and humans. The Gylfaginning moves from the great battles, Thor against Jörmungandr, Odin against Fenrir, Freyr against Surtur, to the burning and flooding, and then quickly to the renewal, without pausing to account for the minor races of beings who populated the old world. The dwarves simply drop out of the narrative, their story left incomplete, their fate left to inference. This incompleteness is characteristic of what we have of Norse mythology in general. The sources are fragmentary, preserved by happenstance in the interests of medieval Christian scribes who had their own reasons for what they chose to record and how they chose to frame it. The dwarves, as beings associated with darkness and the underground, may have seemed too close to demons or too distant from the heroic narratives that interested the saga writers to warrant detailed treatment in the eschatological sections. Or perhaps there were other poems, other tales now lost, that told of dwarven heroes or dwarven fate at the end of days. We can only work with what survives, and what survives gives us groaning at stone doors and then silence. Yet this very silence invites us to consider what the dwarves' role in Ragnarok might have been, based on everything we know of their nature and function throughout the rest of the mythological corpus. Consider Gleipnir, the fetter that bound Fenrir. This dwarven creation, made from impossible ingredients, from the sound of a cat's footfall and the beard of a woman and the roots of a mountain and the breath of a fish, was designed specifically to hold the wolf until the end of time. The dwarves who made it knew what they were making and why. They understood that they were fashioning a temporary bond, a chain that would hold not forever, but only until the appointed hour. Into the very substance of Gleipnir was woven the knowledge of its eventual breaking. When Fenrir finally strains against his bonds and shatters them, as the prophecies declare he will, is that a failure of dwarven craft, or a fulfillment of it? The fetter held for all the ages it was meant to hold. It bought time for the gods, allowed the world to continue, permitted the full span of human and divine history to unfold before the wolves came. The dwarves made a tool for a specific purpose, and that tool accomplished its purpose perfectly. That the purpose was temporary does not diminish the achievement. Every sword will eventually break, every wall will eventually fall, every binding will eventually fail. The dwarves understood this, perhaps better than any beings in the cosmos. They were makers, and makers know that nothing lasts forever. What matters is that it lasts long enough. Similarly, Mjolnir in Thor's hand at Ragnarok represents the culmination of dwarven artistry, the moment for which the hammer was always destined. Brock and Sindri, those brothers who worked in competition against the sons of Ivaldi, who wagered their craft against Loki's cunning, who endured the gadfly's torments to complete their work. They made a weapon for the end of the world. When Thor faces the world serpent in the final battle, when he swings Mjolnir with all the strength of the thunder god against the scales of Jörmungandr, the hammer performs as it was made to perform. Thor kills the serpent. He strikes the blow that ends the greatest monster of the deep. That he himself then stumbles 9 steps and falls dead from the serpent's venom does not diminish his victory or the hammer's power. The weapon did what it was made to do. The dwarves' craft held true at the crucial moment. Gungnir, too, plays its part. Odin rides to Ragnarok with his spear in hand, the weapon that never misses, the symbol of his authority as Lord of the Slain. He faces Fenrir, the wolf he helped to bind, the beast who has waited through all the ages for this meeting. The prophecy is clear. The wolf will swallow the All-Father. Gungnir will not save Odin. Nothing could. But the spear is present, is wielded, is part of the final battle. The sons of Ivaldi, who forged it in the early days, could not have known precisely what their creation would face, but they made it to be the finest weapon of the greatest god, and at the end, it fulfills that purpose even in defeat. There is something profound in this vision of dwarven work at Ragnarok. The treasures were not made to prevent the end. The dwarves, with their deep wisdom, surely knew that nothing could prevent it. They were made to be worthy of the end, to be fitting implements for the final battle, to ensure that when the gods faced their doom, they did so fully equipped, fully armed, wielding the finest creations that skill and fire and magic could produce. The dwarves' gift to the cosmos was not salvation but excellence. They ensured that the end, when it came, would be worthy of all that preceded it. And what of Draupnir, the ring that drips? Odin's arm ring, which produced 8 new rings of equal weight every 9 nights, was a symbol of abundance, of wealth that perpetuated itself, of the All-Father's generosity and power. At the funeral of Balder, when the bright god was laid on his ship to be burned, Odin bent down and whispered something in his dead son's ear, words that no one else heard, that became one of the great mysteries of the mythology, a secret that Odin alone knew. And he placed Draupnir on the pyre with Balder, sending the ring into hell with the dead god. The image is striking, the ring of perpetual generation, of endless production, consigned to the realm of the dead, where nothing grows, where all abundance ceases. Yet this was not truly the end for Draupnir. When Hermoda rode to Hel to plead for Balder's return, when he begged Hel to release the beloved god so that all the worlds might cease their weeping, Balder sent the ring back with him as proof and as a gift to Odin. Draupnir returned from the land of the dead, carrying with it whatever essence it had absorbed in that realm, whatever understanding of ending and continuation it had gained from its sojourn beyond the veil. The ring that endlessly produced had itself been reproduced, returned, resurrected in a way that Balder himself could not be until after the flames of Ragnarok had burned away the old world. Some scholars have seen in Draupnir's journey a template for renewal, a suggestion that the treasures of the dwarves, like the gods themselves, might pass through destruction and emerge transformed. The ring went to Hel and came back. Might it, or creations like it, survive the end of all things and persist into the green new world? The Völuspá's description of the gods finding their old gaming pieces in the grass suggests that some artifacts of the previous age do endure, do persist through the destruction into the renewal. Perhaps the dwarves' greatest works, imbued with more than mortal skill, partake of the immortality that they granted to the gods who wielded them. But here we venture into speculation, into the spaces between the texts where certainty dissolves into possibility. The surviving sources do not tell us what happened to Mjolnir after Thor fell, whether it lay beside his body on the field of Vigridr, or was somehow preserved for the new world. They do not describe the fate of Gungnir after Fenrir swallowed Odin, whether the spear was lost in the wolf's belly or retrieved by the god's avengers. The treasures, like their makers, fade from the narrative at the crucial moment, leaving us to imagine their endings or their continuations. What the texts do make clear is the essential role the dwarves played in equipping the cosmos for its entire existence, from creation to destruction. The world that emerged from Ymir's body was structured by dwarven labour, the 4 at the corners holding up the sky, creating the very possibility of life beneath the heavens. The gods who ruled that world were armed by dwarven craft, their weapons, their treasures, their symbols of power all forged in subterranean smithies by beings who understood the secret names of fire and metal. The monsters that threatened the world were contained by dwarven cunning, Gleipnir holding Fenrir, buying the ages of peace before the inevitable end. And when that end came, the dwarves' work was present, was central, was essential to the final drama even as the dwarves themselves stood weeping at their stone doors. This integration of the dwarves into every level of cosmic history suggests that they were far more important to the Norse understanding of reality than their relative marginality in the narratives might indicate. They appear briefly, accomplish their tasks, and retreat to their underground halls, but the effects of their appearances ripple throughout the mythology. Without them, there would be no structured world, no armed gods, no bound wolf, no treasures to symbolize divine power. The dwarves are the infrastructure of the Norse cosmos, the makers and maintainers who work behind the scenes, while gods and giants battle, and humans live their brief lives in between. The prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, our most systematic source for Norse cosmology, preserves more information about the dwarves than the poetic Edda, though it does so in a way that reflects Snorri's Christian context and his particular literary goals. Snorri was writing in the 13th century in Iceland for an audience that included Norwegian nobles and Icelandic scholars who valued the old poetry as a cultural heritage, even though they had converted to Christianity centuries before. His work is explicitly a handbook for poets, a guide to understanding the kennings and references that filled traditional skaldic verse. The myths he preserves are preserved for this purpose, to explain why gold is called Sif's hair, or why poetry is called the mead of Odin, or why the sky is called the burden of the dwarves. This means that Snorri's treatment of the dwarves emphasizes those aspects of their nature and activity that generated poetic vocabulary. The forging of the treasures is told in detail because each treasure became a way of referring to various concepts in court poetry. Mjolnir allowed poets to call Thor the hammer's owner, or to describe battle as the thunder of Mjolnir. Draupnir allowed gold to be called the ring's offspring, or the dripping of Odin's arm. The poetic utility of the myths determined to a significant degree which myths were preserved and how thoroughly they were elaborated. The eschatological sections of Snorri's work are less detailed about the dwarves, because the dwarves were less useful for poetic reference in those contexts. The deaths of gods, the battles of Ragnarok, the destruction and renewal, these provided their own vocabulary, their own kennings, and the dwarves were not central to them. Hence Snorri moves past the groaning dwarves without elaboration, without the kind of extended narrative he provides for the forging of the treasures or the story of Alvis. The silence about dwarven fate at the end is at least partly a silence of utility. There was no poetic need to know what happened to the dwarves, so the knowledge, if it existed, was not preserved. Yet the dwarves' groaning does appear in Völuspá, the poem that Snorri draws upon most heavily for his account of Ragnarok. This suggests that even in the older tradition, the fate of the dwarves was more atmospheric than narrative, more a detail of cosmic mood than a story with its own arc and resolution. The seeress in her trance sees all that will happen, and the dwarves' lamentation is part of what she sees, but it is a background detail, a brushstroke in the larger painting, not the focus of her prophetic gaze. The gods die in single combat named and heroic. The monsters surge forward, identified and terrible. The dwarves weep, anonymous and helpless, a chorus of grief for the ending of all they had made. This chorus of grief, this collective lamentation rising from the stone depths, marks the dwarves as witnesses to the cosmic collapse in a way that distinguishes them from almost every other category of being in the Norse mythological framework. The gods fight and fall. The giants attack and are destroyed. The monsters break free and meet their doom in mutual annihilation with their divine adversaries. But the dwarves neither fight nor flee. They stand at the thresholds of their mountain halls and mourn, their voices joining in a sound that must have echoed through the breaking world like the groan of stone itself under impossible pressure. This is not cowardice, for cowardice implies the possibility of courage, the expectation of action. The dwarves are not warriors who fail to fight. They are craftsmen watching their works undone, architects witnessing the collapse of the structures they spent eternity building. Their grief is the grief of makers, and it carries a particular resonance that martial valor could never achieve. The image of the weeping dwarves at their stone doors deserves contemplation, for it reveals something essential about how the Norse understood the relationship between creation and destruction, between making and unmaking. When Völuspá describes the dwarves groaning before their stone doors, the phrase in Old Norse is Dvergar stynja, and the verb suggests not merely crying but a deep visceral sound of anguish, the kind of groan that comes from the body's core when language fails. These are beings who shaped the cosmos, who held the sky upon their shoulders, who forged the weapons that defined divine power, and now they can only stand and make sounds of inexpressible loss. The stone doors before which they stand represent both their characteristic habitation and, perhaps, their final refuge. Though whether that refuge will survive Ragnarok, the sources do not tell us. The image is one of threshold existence, of beings caught between the safety of their underground realm and the catastrophe unfolding in the world above and around them. They cannot retreat fully into the stone, for they must witness. They cannot emerge to participate, for they are not beings of battle. They occupy the liminal space of the doorway, watching everything end. The contrast between this final appearance and the dwarves' earlier roles in the mythological narrative could not be more stark. When we first encounter them in the cosmogonic accounts, they are agents of transformation, turning dead matter into living form, emerging from the primordial flesh to become makers in their own right. When we see them forging the treasures of the gods, they are figures of supreme competence, masters of arts that even the Aesir cannot replicate. When they bind Fenrir, they accomplish what gods and giants together could not achieve, creating through cunning and craft a chain that defied all natural law. But at the end, they are reduced to mourning, their agency stripped away by the sheer scale of cosmic dissolution. The fire of Surtur, the advancing armies of Muspelheim, the breaking of the world tree, the darkening of the sun, these are forces beyond even dwarven skill to counter. The makers become witnesses, and their grief testifies to the magnitude of what is being lost. Yet the Völuspá, for all its apocalyptic power, does not end with destruction. The seeress's vision continues past the fire and the flood, past the death of the gods and the breaking of the world. She sees a new earth rising from the waters, green and fertile with waterfalls cascading and eagles hunting fish in renewed streams. She sees the surviving gods gathering on the plain of Idavola, finding in the grass the golden gaming pieces they had used in the age before catastrophe. She sees Baldur returning from hell, reconciled with Höder, the blind god who had unwittingly slain him. This renewal, this cyclical pattern of destruction and rebirth, raises questions about the dwarves that the sources do not answer, but that we must consider if we are to understand their full mythological significance. Do the dwarves survive into the renewed world? Do they emerge from their stone halls when the fires have cooled and the waters have receded? Do they resume their crafting, making new treasures for the new gods in the new cosmos? The silence of the sources on this point is eloquent. Neither Völuspá nor Snorri's prose account mentions the dwarves in the context of renewal. The gods who survive or return are named Vidar and Vali, Modi and Magni, Baldur and Höder. The humans who survive, sheltered in the wood called Hodmimis Holt, are mentioned, Leif and Lifthrasir, who will repopulate the earth. But the dwarves receive no mention in these passages of hope and new beginning. This could mean several things. Perhaps their survival was assumed, so obvious as to require no statement. After all, if the cosmos continues, surely the craftsmen who maintain it must continue as well. Perhaps their fate was genuinely unknown, a gap in the tradition that even the original poets could not fill. Or perhaps, most intriguingly, the dwarves were understood to be so fundamentally tied to the old cosmos that they could not exist in the new one. They emerged from Ymir's flesh, from the matter of the first giant, from the substance of the old creation. If the new world rises fresh from the waters, uncorrupted by the violence and fate that defined the previous cycle, perhaps it rises without dwarves, without beings whose very existence was rooted in death and decay and the transformation of corpse flesh into conscious life. This last possibility, though speculative, would explain the profound grief of the dwarves at Ragnarok. They weep not merely for the destruction of their works, but for their own ending, for the knowledge that they belong to the old order so completely that they cannot pass into the new. The treasures they forged, Mjolnir, Gungnir, Draupnir, are not mentioned in the renewal passages either, though some interpreters have suggested that the golden gaming pieces found by the returning gods are the same ones used in the age before. If the treasures survive, they do so as relics of the old world, objects whose meaning and power derive from a cosmic order that no longer exists. But the dwarves themselves, the makers of those treasures, may be too deeply embedded in the old creation to survive its final dissolution. Their groaning at the stone doors may be the sound of beings who know they are witnessing not merely the end of an age but their own extinction. This interpretation, while not provable from the sources, aligns with certain patterns in how the Norse understood the relationship between origins and endings. Beings and objects often carry the nature of their creation throughout their existence. The dwarves, born from corruption, associated with death and the underground, craftsmen of the old gods for the old conflicts, may be constitutionally incapable of existing in a world that has been purified by fire and renewed by water. They are creatures of the between time, the long age between the first creation and the final destruction, and when that age ends, they end with it. The new world, rising innocent from the cosmic waters, has no place for beings whose hands still remember the feel of Ymir's maggot-riddled flesh, whose forges still ring with the shaping of weapons for battles now concluded, whose skill was developed in service to gods now dead or transformed by their passage through death and return. The theological and philosophical implications of this reading are considerable. If the dwarves truly perish at Ragnarok, then the Norse cosmos exhibits a pattern of necessary loss in which even the most skilled and essential beings cannot escape the consequences of their origins. The dwarves did not choose to emerge from Ymir's flesh. They did not choose to be creatures of the underground, associated with death and the manipulation of material substance. These were their nature, given to them by the circumstances of their arising, and no amount of skill or service could change that fundamental constitution. Their forging of divine treasures, their holding up of the sky, their binding of the wolf, all of these magnificent achievements could not redeem them from the taint of their beginning. In the end, origins determine fates, and the dwarves' origin in corruption seals their ending in destruction. Yet we must be careful not to over-systematize where the sources themselves are fragmentary and ambiguous. The Norse mythological tradition was not a unified theological system, but a collection of stories, poems, and beliefs that varied across time and space, that were shaped by individual poets and local communities, that evolved over centuries before being written down by Christian scholars with their own agendas and limitations. The silence about dwarven fate after Ragnarok may simply be silence, an absence of information rather than a deliberate statement about their extinction. The poets and storytellers who shaped the tradition may never have considered the question, focused as they were on the fates of gods and heroes rather than the ultimate destiny of the craftsmen who equipped them. We must hold our interpretations lightly, acknowledging that certainty is impossible, and that multiple readings of the evidence can coexist. What remains certain is the dwarves' importance to the mythology as we have it, whatever their ultimate fate may have been imagined to be. From their emergence in the creation accounts through their crafting of cosmic infrastructure and divine treasures, to their mournful presence at the end of all things, they form a continuous thread through the entire mythological tapestry. They are present at the beginning, shaping the world that emerges from Ymir's corpse. They are present in the middle time, forging the weapons and artifacts that define divine power. They are present at the end, grieving for the destruction of everything they made. This comprehensive involvement distinguishes them from many other categories of beings who appear only in specific contexts or narrative moments. The dwarves are woven into the very structure of the Norse cosmos in a way that makes them indispensable to understanding how that cosmos was imagined to work. The textual tradition that preserves this understanding is itself worth examining, for it shapes what we can know and how we can know it. The poetic Edda, our primary source for the oldest mythological traditions, survives mainly in a single manuscript, the Codex Regius, written in Iceland around 1270 CE. This manuscript preserves poems that are certainly older than their transcription, but how much older remains debated. Some scholars have argued for compositions as early as the 9th century, while others prefer later dates, and the truth likely varies from poem to poem. Völuspá, the great prophetic poem that provides our most detailed account of creation and destruction, is usually dated to the late 10th or early 11th century, around the time of Iceland's conversion to Christianity. This dating means that even our oldest source for the dwarven role in cosmogony and eschatology may already reflect Christian influence, may already be shaped by the comparison with biblical accounts of creation and apocalypse that the poets could not have avoided encountering. The Dvergar, the catalogue of dwarf names in Völuspá, poses particular problems for interpretation. It lists dozens of names, many of which appear nowhere else in the surviving literature, and its purpose within the poem is unclear. Some names are transparent. Ni and Inidi suggest new moon and dark moon. Nordri and Sudri and Ostri and Vestri are simply the cardinal directions, and many others have obvious meanings related to death, darkness, or craftsmanship. But other names are opaque, resistant to etymological analysis, possibly reflecting local traditions or individual poetic invention that we can no longer recover. The catalogue may be a relatively late addition to the poem, inserted by a poet who wished to display his learning or preserve a tradition of dwarf naming that was in danger of being forgotten. Or it may be ancient, a genuinely archaic element that survived because of its formal list-like structure. We cannot be certain, and this uncertainty affects our understanding of how centrally the dwarves figured in the original mythological tradition versus how they were elaborated by later poets and systematizers. Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, written around 1220 CE, provides far more narrative detail about the dwarves than the poetic Edda, but this detail comes at a cost. Snorri was a Christian writing for Christians, and his treatment of the old myths is explicitly framed as the study of cultural heritage rather than religious truth. He hemerizes the gods, suggesting that they were originally human heroes who were later worshipped as deities. He structures his material according to the demands of his handbook for poets, emphasizing those myths that generated useful poetic vocabulary. His account of the forging of the treasures, for instance, is told because it explains why certain kennings exist, why gold can be called Sif's hair, or why a ship can be called Freya's board. This functional approach to mythology means that Snorri preserves what was useful for his purposes and may have omitted or abbreviated what was not. The dwarves receive detailed treatment when they forge treasures because those treasures matter for poetry. They receive less attention in eschatological contexts because their role there generated fewer kennings. Yet Snorri also preserves material that seems to have no immediate poetic utility, suggesting that his antiquarian interests extended beyond the strictly practical. His account of the cosmos's structure, of the worlds and their relationships, of the mechanics of the sky vaults supported by dwarven pillars. These details serve no obvious kenning-generating purpose, but seem to reflect genuine interest in how the old Northmen imagined their universe to be constructed. This interest may have led Snorri to preserve traditions about the dwarves that would otherwise have been lost, traditions that emphasize their cosmological rather than their merely narrative importance. The four dwarves holding up the sky corners, for instance, appear in Snorri's account but not clearly in the poetic Edda, suggesting either that Snorri had access to traditions we have lost, or that he elaborated and systematized hints in his sources into the clear structural account he provides. The relationship between Snorri's prose and the earlier poetry is complex and much debated. Sometimes Snorri clearly paraphrases or quotes poems we can identify, allowing us to check his work against independent sources. Other times he provides information that appears nowhere else, leaving us uncertain whether he drew on lost sources, on oral traditions that were never written down, or on his own interpretive elaboration of ambiguous material. For the dwarves, this uncertainty is particularly acute because so much of what we know about them comes from Snorri, from passages that cannot be verified against other texts. Did the dwarves truly emerge from Ymir's flesh as maggots before being granted human shape and understanding by divine decree? Snorri says so, but no surviving poem explicitly confirms this account. Did the four dwarves truly hold up the sky at the cardinal points named for the directions they guarded? Snorri implies as much, but the evidence is fragmentary. We are dependent on his Christian, 13th century, handbook-oriented account for information that may or may not accurately reflect pre-Christian belief, and we must acknowledge this dependence even as we work with the material we have. The tale of Alvis, the all-wise dwarf who sought to marry Thor's daughter, provides one of our few opportunities to see dwarven character developed beyond the pure function of craftsmanship. In this poem, preserved in the poetic Edda as Alvismal, the dwarf approaches Thor to claim a bride who has apparently been promised to him. Thor, either unaware of the promise or unwilling to honour it, engages Alvis in a contest of wisdom, asking him to name various cosmic elements according to the vocabulary of different races: gods, humans, elves, dwarves, giants. The dwarf answers each question correctly, demonstrating the comprehensive knowledge his name claims, reciting the names for earth and sky, sun and moon, wind and fire, sea and forest, across all the categories of beings who inhabit the Norse cosmos. Yet, for all his wisdom, Alvis fails to notice the one thing that would have saved him: the passage of time. Thor extends the questioning through the night hours, each answer drawing the dwarf further into the trap until the first light of dawn breaks across the horizon. The sun strikes Alvis where he stands, and the poem ends with Thor's triumphant declaration that the dwarf has been outwitted, caught above ground by daylight, turned to stone by the very sun whose names he could so eloquently recite in all the tongues of all the worlds. The poem preserves no description of the petrification itself, no account of Alvis's final moments as his flesh hardens to rock, but the implication is clear and final. The all-wise dwarf, who knew every name for everything, could not perceive the simplest truth: that Thor was not seeking knowledge but stalling for time, that the questions were not a test but a trap, that wisdom without prudence is no protection against cunning. The Alvismal raises questions about dwarven nature that echo through the broader corpus. What is it about sunlight that proves fatal to these beings? The poem takes for granted a belief that is mentioned elsewhere only in passing, that dwarves cannot endure the sun, that daylight turns them to stone. This vulnerability connects them to the night, to the underground, to the darkness beneath the earth's surface where they make their homes and practice their arts. It suggests a fundamental opposition between dwarven nature and the celestial bodies, between the creatures who emerged from Ymir's rotting flesh and the bright lights that wheel through the sky above the earth they help to hold aloft. There is something paradoxical in this, for the dwarves created objects that shine with light: the golden hair of Sif, the gleaming boar gull in Bursti, treasures that glow and glitter with captured brilliance, yet they themselves cannot endure the greatest source of light in all the cosmos. They are masters of fire and forge, workers with molten metal and burning heat, yet the sun's rays prove lethal where furnace flames do not. This suggests a qualitative difference between types of light, between the controlled fire of the smithy and the cosmic radiance of the sun, between illumination that can be harnessed and light that participates in the divine order of the universe in ways that exclude those who dwell in darkness. The contest of wisdom itself reveals something profound about dwarven knowledge and its limitations. Alvis can name everything. He knows what the earth is called among the Aesir and the Vanir, among humans and giants, among elves and dwarves, in the halls of the dead. His knowledge is encyclopedic, comprehensive, a mastery of nomenclature that spans all the peoples and all the realms. Yet this knowledge is static, categorical, a catalogue of names without insight into circumstance or intention. Alvis knows what things are called but fails to understand what Thor is doing, mistakes a trap for a test, treats the gods' questions as honest inquiry rather than strategic delay. His wisdom is vast but somehow incomplete, brilliant in scope yet blind to the practical realities of his situation. He's so absorbed in demonstrating his knowledge that he fails to notice dawn approaching, so proud of his correct answers that he does not question why Thor keeps asking. The name All-Wise becomes bitterly ironic, for this dwarf who knows all names does not know enough to save himself. This tale may reflect broader cultural attitudes toward dwarven intelligence, a recognition that their wisdom, however impressive, operates within constraints, that their mastery of craft and lore does not translate into the kind of cunning that protects one in dealings with gods. The dwarves are tricked repeatedly in the myths, by Loki who steals their creations, by Thor who delays until dawn, by gods who impose conditions and extract oaths that bind the dwarves to their purposes. For all their skill, for all their knowledge, the dwarves seem vulnerable to those who approach them with guile, susceptible to manipulation by beings who think in terms of strategy rather than substance. This may be the price of their singular focus on craft, the cost of genius that concentrates all its energy in one domain. The dwarves are supreme in their forges, unmatched in their creative power, but outside that context they become prey to those who excel in other modes of being. Yet we must be cautious about drawing too sharp a distinction between dwarven wisdom and divine cunning. The myths also show dwarves as creators of items that embody profound understanding of cosmic forces. Gleipnir, the fetter that binds Fenrir, demonstrates not just technical skill but deep insight into the nature of paradox and impossibility. The ring Draupnir, which multiplies itself, suggests understanding of generative principles that go beyond mere craftsmanship. The ship Skidbladnir, which always finds favourable wind and can be folded to fit in a pouch, implies mastery over space and scale that borders on the metaphysical. These are not the creations of beings who merely know how to work metal. They are artifacts that encode wisdom about the fundamental structures of reality. The dwarves may be vulnerable to tricks, but they understand secrets of existence that the gods themselves cannot replicate. Perhaps this is why the gods must deal with them at all, why they cannot simply take what they want or make what they need. The dwarves possess knowledge that is essential to divine purposes, and this knowledge grants them a kind of power, even as they remain subordinate in the cosmic hierarchy. The question of dwarven fate through Ragnarok remains one of the most obscure aspects of their mythology, shrouded in the same darkness from which they emerged. The great eschatological poems, Völuspá most prominently, describe the final battle in vivid detail, cataloguing which gods will face which monsters, which beings will fall and which will survive, how the world will burn and sink and rise again. Yet the dwarves appear in these accounts only glancingly, if at all. Völuspá mentions them groaning before their stone doors as the end approaches, the sound of dwarven lamentation marking one of the signs that Ragnarok is imminent. This image suggests that the dwarves, with their deep earth knowledge, sense the approaching catastrophe before others perceive it, that their connection to the stone and the underground gives them early warning of the tremors that will eventually shake all worlds to destruction. They groan but do not act, mourn but do not fight, perceive doom but cannot prevent it. Their role in the final crisis seems passive, reactive, a witness to destruction rather than a participant in either the battle or the renewal that follows. This absence from the combat at Ragnarok distinguishes the dwarves from almost every other category of being in Norse mythology. The gods will fight and die. The giants will storm across Bifrost and assault Asgard. The monsters, Fenrir, the Midgard serpent, the hosts of Hel, will break their bonds and claim their vengeance. Even humans have their role, for the warriors of Valhalla will stream forth to fight alongside Odin in the last battle. But the dwarves, they groan before their doors and then disappear from the narrative. No dwarf is named among the combatants on either side. No dwarven artifact plays a decisive role in the final conflict, though Mjolnir will shatter the serpent's skull and Gleipnir will eventually fail to hold Fenrir. The makers of the weapons are absent when those weapons meet their ultimate tests. Several interpretations might explain this absence. Perhaps the dwarves, as creatures of making rather than fighting, simply have no place in a narrative of pure destruction. They are defined by their creative power, by their ability to bring new things into being, and Ragnarok is the negation of creation, the unmaking of all that has been made. There is nothing for smiths to forge when forging itself becomes meaningless, no treasures to craft when treasure will burn with everything else. The dwarves' silence may reflect the silencing of their essential function, the irrelevance of craftsmanship in a cosmos that is ending. Alternatively, their underground nature may protect them from the fires that consume the surface world. The flames of Surtur that burn heaven and earth may not reach the deep places where dwarves dwell, may pass over the caverns and tunnels where these beings have always made their homes. If so, the dwarves might survive Ragnarok in their darkness, enduring through the destruction as they endured through the ages before, emerging when new earth rises from the sea to find their skills needed once again. This possibility, dwarven survival through cosmic catastrophe, resonates with the cyclical elements in Norse eschatology. The world that rises after Ragnarok is described in terms that suggest continuity as well as renewal. Certain gods survive or return. A new human couple emerges to repopulate the earth. The fields grow green again without being sowed. If the cosmos requires structure, if the new world needs the same kind of shaping and supporting and furnishing that the old world required, then beings with dwarven skills would be essential to its establishment. The sky would need to be held up, new treasures would need to be forged, the raw materials of existence would need to be worked into useful forms. Perhaps the dwarves' absence from Ragnarok is precisely what ensures their presence afterward, their withdrawal from battle functioning as preservation for future necessity. Yet we must acknowledge how much of this interpretation is speculation, inference drawn from silence rather than statement. The surviving sources simply do not tell us what happens to the dwarves during or after Ragnarok. Snorri, for all his systematic interest in cosmological structure, does not address their eschatological fate. The Poetic Edda mentions their groaning, and then moves on to matters deemed more central to the apocalyptic narrative. We are left to wonder whether this silence reflects lost traditions that once explained dwarven fate, or whether the original mythmakers simply never considered the question, never felt the need to account for beings who were always peripheral to the divine drama, despite their essential contributions to it. The dwarves exist in a strange categorical space, necessary but not central, powerful but not prominent, remembered for what they made rather than who they were. This marginality may itself be significant, may tell us something about how the Norse understood the relationship between creation and creator, between artifact and artificer. We remember Mjolnir more than Brokkr and Sindri. We speak of Odin's spear without always recalling who forged it. The treasures have transcended their makers, become identified with the gods who wield them rather than the dwarves who crafted them. There is something melancholy in this, a kind of erasure that accompanies creation itself. The dwarf pours his skill and knowledge into the object, imbues it with properties that seem almost magical, and then steps back into shadow while the object goes forth to make history. Mjolnir will defend Asgard, will hold back the giants, will shatter the serpent at the world's end, and all of this glory attaches to Thor, not to the sweating craftsman who worked the bellows while Loki and Flyform bit their hands. The dwarves are necessary to the story but not protagonists of it, enablers of divine narrative without being subjects of their own. Perhaps this reflects something true about craftsmanship itself, about the way the made object achieves an existence independent of its maker. A smith forges a sword. The sword outlives him, passes through hands he never knew, accomplishes deeds he never imagined. The object takes on its own history, its own meaning, its own mythic weight. The maker recedes into the past, becomes a name attached to origin rather than a character in ongoing narrative. The dwarves experience this recession collectively, their entire people becoming the named but absent source of objects that matter more than they do. It is a kind of sacrifice, this surrender of identity to creation, this willingness to be forgotten so that what one has made may be remembered. The dwarves give the gods their power and then disappear into the earth, returning to the darkness from which they emerged, becoming once again the maggot shapes that writhed in Ymir's decaying flesh, before divine breath granted them consciousness and form. And here, at the end of our examination, we return to that beginning, to the primal scene of emergence, the moment when dead matter generated living beings, when corruption became creation, when the corpse of the first giant gave birth to an entire people. The dwarves carry this origin with them through all their subsequent appearances in the mythology. They are creatures of transformation, beings who came from death into life, from chaos into order, from mindless hunger into conscious craft. Their emergence from Ymir recapitulates in miniature the emergence of the cosmos itself from the void, the same movement from nothing to something, from potential to actual, that characterizes the creation of all things. In a sense, the dwarves are the cosmos in small, the principle of ordered creation embodied in individual beings who spend their existence making order out of chaos, form out of formlessness, treasure out of raw material. This is their gift to the mythology, not just the objects they create, but the demonstration of what creation means. Every treasure they forge shows that the raw can become refined, that the base can become precious, that skill and knowledge can transform the world. The gods themselves depend on this principle, rely on the dwarves to extend their power and guarantee their survival. Without dwarven craft, Odin would have no spear to mark him as sovereign, Thor no hammer to make him mighty, Freya no ship to carry him across the waves. The divine order rests on dwarven foundations, on work done in darkness by beings who emerged from death. There is profound meaning in this arrangement, a recognition that power comes from somewhere, that even gods require support, that the cosmos is not self-sustaining but must be maintained by labour, by skill, by the endless patient work of those who know how to make things that endure. The dwarves will go on working, we must imagine, as long as there is work to be done. They worked before the gods achieved their final form, carved the pillars that hold up the sky, gave shape to the world's structure. They worked through the ages of divine rule, forging treasure after treasure for Azir and Vanir. They will work, perhaps, after Ragnarok has burned away the world we know, will emerge from their caverns to find new stone to carve, new metal to smelt, new wonders to create. Their groaning before the final battle is not despair but recognition, not surrender but acknowledgement of what is coming. They have always known that even the finest craft cannot prevent destruction, that the treasures they make will eventually be lost or broken or burned, yet they go on making, go on creating, go on transforming the raw into the wrought. This is their nature, their purpose, their reason for being. The gods may fight and die, the giants may storm and fall, the cosmos may burn and rise again. The dwarves will be there with their hammers and their tongs, their knowledge and their skill, ready to begin the work of creation once more. And so they linger in the imagination, these dark figures from the deep places of the north. We see them in the shadows of the forge, faces lit by fire, hands black with soot, eyes knowing something we can only guess at. They do not speak to us in their own voices. Their words, when we have them, are reported by others, filtered through Snorri's Christian learning or the cryptic verses of anonymous poets. Yet they are there, present in every thunderclap when Mjolnir strikes, in every gleam of gold that catches the eye, in every object that seems to hold more meaning than its materials can explain. They made the world functional, gave the gods their tools, held up the sky so that we could walk beneath it. They asked for nothing but the chance to practice their craft, to demonstrate what maggots could become when gods breathed purpose into them. In the end, perhaps that is the deepest lesson they teach, that origin does not determine destiny, that what something came from matters less than what it becomes, that even beings born of death and decay can create treasures that will shine until the world's ending and perhaps beyond. The dwarves shaped the cosmos with their hands. In return, we remember them with our words, keeping their stories alive in the darkness where they have always dwelt, waiting for someone to speak their names.